Good.
All right. Hello. This is assessment group number 4. I'm Melissa, and I'm here with Michael, Indy, and Selena. And we are going to be talking about Chapter 11, Report Card Grading, summarizing the achievement at a point in time. And the assessment or learning targets are understand the purpose for report card grades. Select information about a student's current level of academic achievement for inclusion in the report card grade. Summarize assessment information accurately and combine rubric ratings with other assessment information to arrive at an accurate, fair, and defensible end of term grade. So, with that, I'm going to let Selena kick it off with our first learning target.
Thank you, Melissa. So, yes, our first learning target I have, and that one was understanding the purpose for report card grades. And when I first decided, because we randomly choose which ones we want to do, I was like, oh, yeah, I got this one in the bag. But after I read that chapter, it made me rethink my whole process. So, what really made the chapter really made clear to me is that, the main purpose of report cards is to communicate where the students are academically, nothing more, nothing less. The chapter talks about how grades are really just a way to summarize a lot of information into one symbol so it can be easily understood. But what I got out of it, or what hit me, like a hit dog will holler to me, was that we try to make is that when we try to make grades do too much, like motivate the students or reward effort, and that can kind of like send the wrong message. So, like for example, in my classroom, I can see how easy it is to mix those things. So, for example, I do value effort and participation and behavior in my classroom because of project based, but this chapter made me think about how those things should not be mixed into the academic grade itself. Since my classroom is project based, I already try to make sure the grades reflect what the students actually understand and produce. Like with their proposals, I use rubrics, so the grade is based on what they demonstrate, not just as if they tried to complete it. I've also had situations where students really work hard, but still struggle to fully meet the standard. Before I would feel it would feel naturally just to like help them, help these grades because their effort. Okay, yeah, they didn't do this, but they really put forth an effort. But this chapter made me realize that doing that can actually kind of confuse what the grade is really saying. So at the end of the day, the grade should clearly answer what does the student know and what can they do right now. Everything else, like effort, behavior, should be tracked separately. So that's my piece on that when it comes to report cards. And it kind of like punched me in the gut. I was getting beat up all through this chapter when it came to that.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and slide into learning target two. I'm actually gonna talk about some of the things Selena mentioned in my reflection piece because like I'm on the same page. Um, but learning target two is selecting information about a student's current level of academic achievement for inclusion in the final report card grade. Um, so build on the idea that grades are meant to communicate that learning targets um or the idea that grades should communicate that learning targets are being met. Um, the book wants us to really think about what information really belongs in the grade then. And so this chapter defines grading as condensing a large amount of information into a single symbol for communication. And that's the case, then every piece of information we include contributes to the message that the symbol sends. So the question becomes, what evidence actually represents a student's level of achievement? Um, and the authors of the book are kind of clear with what they say, what they think that grades reflect what a student knows and can do relative to the learning targets, and not things like effort, behavior, completion. The moment we include those other factors, the grade starts communicating multiple things at once, and so the message of achievement becomes unclear. So this learning target is really about selection. Not everything students do should be included in a grade, even if it happens in the classroom. Um, and one important idea is the distinction between practice and evidence of learning. Um, Homework, classwork, and other early things are often part of the learning process, and they give students opportunity to make mistakes and get feedback, or get feedback and improve. But that doesn't really always mean that they are best indicators of what a student has ultimately learned. And so this chapter pushes us to really prioritize evidence that is, aligned with the learning target and of high quality and representative of the student's current level of understanding. And so that often means, looking more closely at summative assessments or performances where students are expected to demonstrate mastery. Another key idea is that not all evidence should be treated equally. Some assessments provide stronger evidence of learning than others. For example, an assessment that directly targets reasoning or conceptual understanding should carry more weight than something that measures completion or recall in isolation. And so this chapter also challenges the idea of averaging all scores together. When we average, we treat all pieces of evidence as equally important, even when they're not. And that can distort the message the grade is supposed to be sending to the student. So instead of asking, how much should this assessment count, this particular learning target shifts to the question of, does this piece of evidence belong in the grade at all? And what does it tell us about the student's understanding? And so ultimately, this learning target is about being intentional, where every piece of evidence included in the grade should help answer one question clearly, which is, what is the student's current level of achievement on the intended learning targets? Um, so once we've thought carefully about what evidence actually belongs in the grade, the next step is figuring out how to accurately summarize the information so that it communicates that clearly. And Indy's going to take us into what that looks like with Learning Target 3.
Thank you, Michael. I have learning target 3, summarize assessment information accurately. So building off of what Michael was saying, the big idea for this learning target was that grades must be built from accurate, current, and well organized evidence. There are there's a 5-step process, which makes the 5 key points for this learning target, which are: use the most current information, verify accuracy of the data, convert to a common scale like percentages, points, or rubric scores. Sorry for rubric scores. Weight information is needed and combine thoughtfully. So that's use mean or median appropriately, and median helps avoid distortion. The important principles that were taken away from this learning target was to avoid averaging old and new learning. It can misrepresent the growth. Organize your grades by learning targets and standards. Keep formative versus summative data separate, and grades should represent achievement at a point in time, not a history of struggle. So, thinking about my class, let's say we're talking, not talking, working on the project in the beginning. Some students still figuring things out. Their spacing might be off. Font choices might not match their meaning, and their designs might feel a little all over the place. But after feedback, practice, and revisions, they create a final piece that clearly communicates meaning and shows strong understanding of the concept of learning target. Sorry, y'all. If I average all of those scores from the first rough attempt to the final product, their grade ends up lower, even though they actually learned and improved. And that doesn't feel fair or accurate. So instead, this learning target really emphasizes using the most current evidence of learning. The final project would carry more weight because it represents their true level of understanding. Another thing that stood out to me was making sure the data we're using is actually accurate. I have to be intentional about what I'm assessing. Am I grading their design skills, their understanding of the elements and principles, or am I accidentally grading things like completion or behavior? Because once those get mixed in, the grades start to lose its meaning. I also started to think about how I organize my grade book. Sorry, y'all. It makes so much more sense to group assessments by learning targets, so I can clearly see what students have mastered versus what they're still working on. And so moving forward, I'm really focusing on using the most recent evidence, being intentional with my data, and making sure my grades actually reflect what my students know and can do. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Melissa for learning target 4, I believe. Yes.
Thank you. So I had learning target 4, which is combine rubric ratings with other assessment information to arrive at an accurate, fair, and defensible end of term grade. So basically, this learning target is really about how we take all of the different pieces of our student work and then turn them into the one final grade. and make sure that it makes sense and it accurately represents what that student has learned and their level of learning within our class. So the chapter talks about explaining that, or I guess it explains that grading is basically a summarization of a lot of information into one clear message on what a student knows or can do. And we identify that as commonly a number, which is our grade number. So I think that it's really important that we identify it and think about it like that. Because when we do give our final grade, that's what everyone sees. So the parents see that, the administrators see that, um, even other teachers can see that, and most importantly, the students see that. So it needs to clearly communicate where that student is at and what their end standing was in our classes. So with my class, it can get a little complex because students are working on multiple projects at the same time sometimes because they get multiple grades for one big project. So it'll be like they'll get graded on certain elements and parts to it. So, thinking back to our most recent one was the spline modeling, where they have their initial project within the software, and then they also have to do a presentation and then a pre-production. So each of those get like a rubric, and the rubric breaks down the specific skills, and that is how that works. And some are weighted higher than others. But I also give out smaller assessments like practice activities, guided work, guided notes, and sometimes even participation in when I do like a demonstration, they follow along and then they submit what they did with me, and they can get like a practice grade for that. So for a project-based class like that, the challenge I think comes from how you combine all of that to actually reflect their learning. Because if you have too much of the practice weighted, as we've learned in previous chapters, that can skew our numbers. So, and the chapter definitely talks about this um, with the fair and defensible final grade. So, a good example would be like I have a student who really struggles with the practice work as they're learning. They take a lot longer to learn it, so their practice work is not as great as their final project. Um, and if if everything was weighted equally, that would really affect that student's grade to seem like they are not performing well, even though their final models were up to snuff or up to par. So, and I believe most schools do this where there's tiered grades. I know my school has three tiers, first time practice, major, and then minor. Or sorry, first time practice, minor, then major. Um, so, but some schools do not do that. So the chapter really emphasizes that the grades need to be that accurate, fair, and defensible. And the defensible part stood out to me a lot because with a project-based class, sometimes students will ask, well, why did I get this grade? And sometimes it can be a little bit hard to explain to them, well, this part, this part, this part. So it, with everything else we've learned in the past, to make sure that that's a fair grade and that you can defend that easily and quickly. Um, so and be able to pinpoint where points were taken off or maybe points were added within their work. So it's definitely not a grading should never be a feeling or, well, I thought you did okay, so I picked a number between 1 and 10. So it also made me think about being like intentional with what I include in the grade. So previous chapters have talked about this a lot, but here with the report cards, it really like drilled into my head because I I like to grade sometimes a little bit too much, and after this chapter I really realized how like in the long run that can affect what how they how it looks like they're learning, and they might be learning really well, but I grade so much that it brings that overall grade down, or it looks like their learning is not at the right level. Or vice versa, you don't grade enough and the kids just do really, really well on the few things you grade. So, overall, this learning target is really about being thoughtful and purposeful with your grading and making sure that when it all comes together, it's accurate. So, and it's not just about plugging in the numbers and like, oh, the gradebook created this end number. It's making sure that everything I include like actually helps students with their learning and communicates to them how their learning is. And as teachers, we tend to know like how a kid is doing. And so I think a good thing is to like go back and just look at those final grades and think to yourself, is that really what I would think in my mind that kid is at? And then maybe reevaluate how much you're grading and how you're putting it all together to make those final grades. And with that, I'm going to pass it into the reflections. I had a little bit of a larger section there.
But yeah, your section covered a lot too. I also include like guided notes and things like that too. I've started adding those in for extra, points and grades so they can have some type of attempt, especially with a project based class. So I use those as well. I heard you touch on that. So I have the first reflection question, which was which ideas did I find most convincing or useful and why? And again, like I said, this chapter really kind of beat me up, made me feel like I was too lenient or I grade with my feelings. So the most, useful idea for me was the importance of not mixing effort, behavior, or compliance into academic grades. And I realized that I tend to have a bad habit of doing this. So next school year is gonna be a whole lot different and they're gonna be a little bit more upset. But that stood out to me because we as teachers we naturally want to reward students who try hard. That's just our nature, especially I'm gonna say as females because we're nurturers. So when they're really putting forth a good effort and doing that, you want to reward that. But the example in the chapter show how students can have the same level of understanding but different grades just because of effort, and that doesn't really give a clear picture of learning. Um, I see a lot of this. I give students who give 100%. I have students who give 100% effort but still struggle, and others who don't put as much effort into it but still perform well. This chapter helped me realize that the grade should reflect their level of mastery and not how hard they try to get there. That doesn't mean that, effort isn't important. It just means that it needs to be communicated in a different way. For example, I can still acknowledge effort through conversations, feedback, or even, separate categories like we talked about with guided notes and things of that nature, but not let it, change the academic grade itself. I think this idea will be useful because it helps keep grading fair and consistent, especially the consistent part. It also helps students understand exactly where they are in their learning instead of giving mixed messages. Overall, the chapter pushed me to be more intentional with grading and really think about what my grades are actually communicating. Um, I am I don't know if anybody else is guilty of this, but like if I have a student at the end of the quarter that is like literally 1 point away from being at the next grade, I'm gonna find something to give. If they're a really good student, they've really been trying, I'm gonna find something to give them a point to to push them up to that next grade. But the chapter is telling me like that's not something I should be doing. But I'm like, they're 1 point away, or they're a tenth of a point away. And then this makes me want to be like, and they work so hard, like they really deserve it. But this chapter is very adamant on like, no, stick to it. So I don't know if I all the way totally agree with like that part at the end when I just said, well, no, with the example, a tenth of a point away or anything like that, especially when the child has really, really tried and really, really done well, but maybe just don't test well. So I'll just have to find a nice, happy medium. And with that, I will send it to a reflection too. And I know y'all can, I want to hear feedback on that one because I want to know after we finish, am I wrong for this or not?
That me or Michael?
Reflection two, I think we went in order.
Is that me?
I think so.
Am I too? Oh, my
Yes.
bad. Okay, so yeah, alignment with beliefs. Yeah, I think I'm gonna touch on some of those things, Selena, as it relates to effort, and grades and whatnot. Because this this particular chapter made me kind of wrestle with this tension between grading as like a communication tool and grading as something that actually functions in a real classroom. Um, on one hand, I agree with the core idea that grades should communicate a student's level of achievement. Um, that aligns with how I kind of structure my class, where tests carry more weight because they're the clearest demonstration of mastery, and quizzes matter a little bit less, and then homework, classwork matters even less than that. But because it's practice, so in essence, I'm already trying to prioritize achievement over completion. But what I start to push back to this chapter is how far the idea can like really realistically go in practice. Um, like first, there's the issue of like all the different learning targets. So you know units are not interchangeable. These I can only speak to my context. So in mathematics, units aren't interchangeable. Just understanding exponential functions is not the same as understanding quadratic functions. So when a chapter talks about prioritizing current level of achievement, that makes sense within a unit. So like if a student struggles early but demonstrates understanding on the test, like I'll already account for that. I'll say like, all right, so you didn't do well in your quiz. I'll go ahead and replace your quiz grade by your test grade because you've gotten better over the course of the unit. Cool. I'm good with that. But across units, that breaks down altogether because like a student's grade should reflect their understanding of all the major topics we've covered, not just whatever's most recent. Um, Otherwise, the grade stops representing the course and it just represents whatever we're doing at the very end. And that doesn't make any sense. And second is the idea of this motivation piece. The chapter talks about grades should not be used to motivate students, but in practice, that's not really how classrooms and students and kids work. A lot of students are not intrinsically motivated just to do practice just for the sake of learning. Um, I wish they were, but that's not the case in class. And so grades are often the reason students engage with the work in the first place. And so while I agree that homework and classwork and stuff are not a pure measure of achievement, I still include it, even at a lower weight because it serves a role. Um, and I think without that structure, significant number of students would simply just not do the practice um, required to learn the material. They're just not going to do it. So for me, the tension is that the chapter isn't whether the book is correct in principle. I think from a theoretical standpoint, yeah, it sounds great. Um, but in practice, it's not really super applicable to be doing to just kind of ignore essentially um, the effort that goes into students completing work and doing things. And so I try to strike a balance in my class, and I want the grades to reflect mastery, which is why summative assessments carry the most weight. But I also have to create the conditions to where students will actively engage in the process of learning that leads to that mastery. Um, so like the question I'm left with is not whether grades should communicate achievement, but how could this possibly work in the realities of how students are motivated and how students engage in the classroom. That's the issue I have with this section. Um, but that's my reflection on this one. And I'll pass it on to uh I guess Andy's got the third one.
That I do. So I have the third, which is which strategy or idea from this. Hold on. Sorry, that's something pop up. All right, which strategy or idea of this from this chapter would you feel most confident implementing, and why? One strategy from this chapter I feel most confident implementing is using the most current evidence of student learning when determining grades. This really aligns with how I already approach teaching, especially in my classroom, where growth and revision are a big part of the process. For example, when my students are working on projects or design compositions, their first attempts are rarely their best. But through feedback and practice and revision, like I stated before, I can clearly see their understanding improve using the most recent work to determine their grade feels more accurate and fair because because it does reflect what they actually know and can do at the end of the learning process rather than penalizing them for where they started. I also feel confident implementing this because it supports a growth mindset in my classroom. Um, it shifts the focus from getting it right the first time to actually learning and improving. So overall, this strategy makes grading feel more meaningful and aligned with my goal of supporting student learning, not just measuring it. And yeah, my response was short and simple to that. It wasn't much for me to do that. Sorry. So passing it on to Melissa.
Thank you. I had a reflection question. What part of this chapter makes you feel uncertain, nervous, or hesitant about applying in practice? So basically, and this kind of stems with like what Selena was talking about, but what makes me most uncertain is the idea of like making sure the grades are fully accurate and defensible. So especially when combining so many different types of assessments. And so, I mean, like, I understand the goal and everything, and the chapter pushes that grades should clearly communicate, like, the student achievement, but, like, I feel like that can be really, really hard with, like, the project-based classes or, like, a software-like class. Because a student can really be mastering my software, but the specific tool that I'm teaching, they're just not getting. But they can get the same thing with another tool. But if just my assessment is on how well they're doing that tool, it can be a little tough because it's like I'm assessing just a tool right now, but the student is grasping the like concept. Um, So I feel like that's the most uncertain part, specifically like with the software classes, because we have certain tools where we have to teach. Like for example, I have to teach a Boolean tool, which essentially like you can take two shapes and like merge them together. And like some kids prefer to use the merge tool over the Boolean, which is called the union. And it does the exact same thing. Um, so it can be hard to say, okay, you're not getting it because you're not getting the tool, but you fully understand that both of them are attaching essentially those shapes together. So that's where my uncertainty comes from there. Does anybody else have anything to add? I know Selena wanted some comments about what she said. I think part of my reflection, I guess, was a whole comment to that, but is there anyone else before we close on out?
No, I agree with Michael. Like, it's a fine line, I think. Like, it doesn't, the chapter, I get what they're saying and I understand it, but it's not real life. It's not real life. Just that's just my opinion. Like, at the end of the day, for me, if they're putting forth their effort and they're trying their best and they grasp an understanding, then I feel like the grade should reflect it. Because you have students that's just gonna chat GPT it up. So I'm
Hmm.
supposed to just give them a grade for chat GPT. And when I know it's chat GPT, if we're supposed to get 80, you're gonna split the grade with chat GPT. So you got a 40. That's what they mad about. Why I get that? Because you're splitting it with your partner. Who is my partner? AI. That's what you want to do. You're going to split the grade. Y'all, it's a group effort, right? So don't think it deserves some points. That's just what I do. So they're not really putting forth the effort when somebody's actually genuinely doing it themselves. Like it's a different, I don't know when this book was written, but it's a different day and age now. It's not like when we were in school. So you have to really go actually research. And we didn't have Google. So showing my
Yeah.
age now, but just for me, it's not realistic. But I get it. I understand the gist of it, and yes, I feel like they should be um graded fairly. And I can get with the 400 just grading the work and not adding behavior like, oh God, I don't like you. I'm gonna just make sure I'm not gonna do that. You know what I'm saying? That's just showing a bias. But yeah, I don't know. It's a fine line. But I mean, I took some stuff from it, and I was just wondering if anybody else do the same.
I feel like it's I'm a hate on the core classes right now. I feel like the chapter talks about it and I feel like it'd be very beneficial for the core classes. Mainly just because like with Michael, if you don't know how to add, you're not going to know how to subtract. So it's not like accurate to show that they can't add, but I feel like with like the extracurricular classes and like the CTE classes, like it's not just like did they learn exactly what I taught? Because like I mean, even though I teach 3ds Max, they can use any 3D software in a range of companies. Um, so it's a matter, and they can do the concepts even if they're not getting like those specific things. So I feel like this chapter is a little bit more centered towards core classes. But like you, I got a couple things. Is there anybody else with comments?
Yeah, I couldn't apply this to my class. Like, it's just it's not it's not feasible in the mathematics classroom. Even the idea, I mean, just the idea of, um, their grades reflect the most recent thing is just absurd. It's like, let's say you want a semester course because all I want to have time teaching was in the semester schedule. Why would their grade reflect January and only January after 5 months goes by? Of August. Like what? Like what? How does that reflect what they've been doing or what's been going on the entirety of the semester? And similarly, if it is supposed to do that, why should I do anything throughout the course of the entire year? Yeah, I could just, which some students think is possible. When I've had students do to think this, like I'll just get an A on the exam. I don't gotta do nothing. And it's like that's wild to me that'd be a thought process. But students have that, and I've had students because the EOC is multiple choice that have slept the whole 4 hours mainly, woke up at the very last minute, bubbled, got a four because it's randomly it is possible. So and then they think, oh, I got me a four, I'm good. But you have like a three in the class. You haven't done nothing. Like you haven't really shown mastery throughout the course of the year. You got lucky. Simply in this particular case, I'm thinking of student got that 88 on the final, but had like a seven in the class. So like you got lucky at the end because you happened to bubble randomly. Because again, the book never opened. He never looked at the question, bubbled the sheet. I'm like, bruh, I you didn't do nothing. You got lucky. You got lucky because numbers work that way. So I can't support that kind of idea. Even the thing with the effort stuff. I remember I had one student where he didn't retain information at all, but he worked so hard, and you feel bad because you have an individual who works very, very hard, never really reaped the benefits. Now I would say he probably should have been tested for special education long ago. Grandmother wouldn't do that, but he's in there. He's working hard. He's coming before school, after school, asking questions, things not being retained. And I'm supposed to be like, all right, you know, you got an F because you didn't master any learning targets. But you're doing every single thing I asked you. Like you're working so hard, and it's more like the system has really failed you in this regard. Not necessarily you. I'm not going to continue that. I'm gonna break that down. I'm like, nah, I'm not about to just work with the system. You are doing everything we're asking you to do. There is something that's actually cognitively taking place that is not being accounted for. I'm going to account for that. Go on, pimpin'. You do what you got to do because you've done every single thing I've asked you to do. And in the beginning of the year, I always say, man, if y'all do everything I asked you to do, you're gonna be fine. If you do everything I asked you to do, you will be fine. And I think that leads to some amount of faith students need to have in their teachers, was like, we will look out for you if you do everything I asked you to do. Like, believe in me. I believe in you. Believe in me as your teacher. I will do everything you can to learn. I can to help you learn this stuff. I need you to do everything you can to help you learn this stuff. It's a team effort. And everybody's doing that. It should work out. And for those rare cases where it doesn't, I got you because you've done everything I'm asked you to do. Um, so that's my soapbox on that. Like I'm not. I'm not digging chapter 11 at all, and I'm not doing none of that stuff. So it's not gonna happen.
I totally agree. I totally agree. Like it just, I read chapter, I was just like, oh, like I was offended. Honestly, I was offended when I read the chapter because I feel like it was talking directly to me. Like, am I doing something wrong? I'm a considered a new teacher because I've only been teaching for 2 years. I came from corporate, so I'm just like, yeah, nah. That's why I'm glad I didn't get the question of what can I implement because I'm not implementing pretty much anything.
That's another like key point you got there, Selena. Like in corporate, um, like it isn't the chapter almost kind of seems like if you hit your quota every time, then you're good. But sometimes like it's those that don't hit the quota but do a really good job with what they do
Right.
and like what they do get done. And sometimes those that just hit the quota, like Michael was saying, are just lucky or they're not putting in as much effort into it. So I agree with you guys. Effort really does need to be a key element there.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you about that with corporate because I'm a prime example. I was the person hitting the quota best of every driving the numbers, highest numbers, but I'm not the one who got the positions when they came open. You see what I'm saying? They gave it to somebody else. So I get it. You know what I mean? So I'm not, yeah, this chapter and what the kids used to say can kick rocks.
I was about to say the exact same thing. I'm like, they can kick rocks for this. Like, kick rocks. Not gonna happen. Kick rocks.
So
Right, well, are we ready to close this on out?
yeah, we
Yeah.
can because this chapter I ain't feeling it.
Yeah, I'll rant for days on this. So yeah, we can get that. It can go.
Right. So I think we basically like summed it up and how we necessarily like feel about it. But essentially the chapter just talked about how to create our grades to be accurate, fair, and defensible. And that is our podcast for chapter 11. Was not our fave, but there it is. And this is assessment group 4, and we hope to see y'all next time. Bye bye.